Thank you for coming to the panel, Connective Tissues, Examining Inscribed Textiles from Egyptian Burial Grounds. My name is Julie Wertz, and I will be chairing this session. After presenting my fellow panelists, I will give a brief introduction, and please use the Q&A function for interacting with the panel during this session. Our first speaker, Taronas, received her PhD in Early Christian and Byzantine Art from Harvard University's Department of History of Art and Architecture in May of this year. She is now a visiting fellow in that department and a Media and Design Fellow at Harvard's Derek Bok Center for Teaching and Learning. Meredyth Winter is a historian of Islamic art who recently defended her dissertation on late Abbasid silk weaving. She is currently a visiting fellow at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard and recently became a first-time mom. Robin Hanson has managed the Textile Conservation Labs at the Cleveland Museum of Art for 20 years and edits textile contributions for the Journal of the American Institute of Conservation and the Getty Conservation Institute Abstract Database. She is a graduate of the Winterthur University of Delaware Conservation Program. I am the Beal Family Postgraduate Fellow in Conservation Science at the Strauss Center for Conservation and Technical Studies at Harvard Art Museums. I have a degree from the University of Glasgow for Center for Textile Conservation and Technical Art History and specialize in textile dye analysis. Mary McWilliams is the Norma Jean Calderwood Curator for Islamic and later Indian Art at the Harvard Art Museums. She is an expert in Islamic art and applied arts and has curated numerous exhibitions on the subject. In Egypt during the late antique and medieval eras, textiles enhanced with inscriptions in Greek, Coptic, and Arabic were cherished objects that served their owners as a visual form of social communication. Through texts, pattern, fibers, and dye colors, they revealed their owners' communal identity, political alliances, and social strata. The Egyptian textile industry was a vital source of revenue for a series of empires and proved itself remarkably adaptable and assimilative to changing circumstances. It connected populations that were diverse in terms of language, ethnicity, and religious affiliation through complex networks of production and consumption. Preserved for centuries in abandoned cemeteries and rubbish heaps by Egypt's arid climate, these textiles are now abundantly represented in American museum collections, their presence resulting from the overlapping efforts of international networks of antiques dealers, scholars, and collectors. The Muslim conquest of Byzantine Egypt in 641 brought in a new ruling elite for whom textiles with Arabic inscriptions were created. Textiles naming the caliph under whose authority they were produced were known as Ṭirāz. Because of their prestige, Ṭirāz textiles were emulated by other groups in Egyptian society. For this panel, we have adopted a more inclusive definition of Ṭirāz textiles, which allows us to encompass fabrics in this latter group, which, while not naming members of the ruling class, are often closely related in style, epigraphy, materials, and technique. The papers in this panel draw out connections and meanings embedded in these inscribed textiles through art historical, technical, and historiographic methods of inquiry. The participants are working collaboratively in support of an exhibition titled Social Fabrics, Inscribed Textiles from Medieval Egyptian Tombs, which will open at the Harvard Art Museums in January of 2022. I will now hand over to my first presenter, Katie.
Thank you, Julie. I'll dive right into the paper. Byzantine weaving is known for its pictorial tradition, for complicated tapestry compositions like this one, containing human and animal figures. Woven inscriptions appear most often in this context as labels that fix the identities of persons represented, especially in cases where iconography might otherwise leave identity ambiguous, as in this tapestry square containing a personification of the city of Panopolis, or the roundel identifying a horseman as Alexander of Macedon. However, a small group of early Byzantine weavings from Egypt, dating between the 4th and 6th centuries, uses text in an entirely different manner, one that fits within the tradition of protective amuletic inscriptions, widespread in the ancient and Byzantine worlds, but whose survival on textiles is very rare. This presentation centers on an early Byzantine textile in the Harvard Art Museums, that will feature in the upcoming Social Fabrics exhibition as an example of woven text from the pre-Islamic era in Egypt. The text on this piece, consisting of paired inscriptions and elaborated letter forms that serve as Christian symbols, creates an instructive comparison to the role of inscriptions on Islamic Ṭirāz, as both are often meant to communicate blessings to their owner, but achieve this transmission of blessing through different textual strategies. The text on this early textile, made in the 5th century or first half of the 6th, acts as talisman, marshaling a selection of protective and magical signs for the benefit of the individual named in the inscriptions. The textile under consideration is remarkable for its size, as evidenced in this photograph including some of our team members for comparison, and for its relative completeness. The large fields of loop pile, some of it in shades of blue, green, and red, would have made this a plush furnishing textile of uncertain function. Its final use as a burial shroud is evident from extensive staining. No figural decoration appears, despite an otherwise rich array of ornamentation. Embellishment comes instead from geometric pattern and interlace, seen here in detail photographs, and from the textual elements its weavers elaborated into almost pictorial devices. Supplementary wefts trace dense webs of interlace pattern across its purple weft-faced bands and squares. Intricate designs like these were considered apotropaic and thought to ensnare evil forces. At both ends of the textile are nearly identical Greek inscriptions that I will argue bear a similar apotropaic function to the interlace webs. One inscription is truncated and lacks the final letters found in the other, suggesting an error on the part of the weaver. The beginnings and ends of the inscriptions are marked with staurograms, a ligature of the Greek letters tau and rho that initially abbreviated the word for cross, stauros, and was by this time viewed as a symbol of Christ. The staurogram is argued by Larry Hurtado to be the first Christian visual image, appearing in 2nd century New Testament manuscripts and predating any extant Christian works of art. The sign could be understood by viewers both as a textual abbreviation and as a highly simplified pictorial representation of the crucified Christ, resembling in its contours the most basic outline of a body suspended on a cross. The staurogram sign in itself thus embodies an interplay between the visual and the textual that I hope to show is at work in this textile. After the initial staurogram in the inscription comes 3 letters, chi, mu, and gamma, an amuletic formula that appears in Christian inscriptions from the 4th century. Its precise meaning is unknown. It certainly references Christ and is usually interpreted as an acrostic for the phrase, Christ born of Mary. The mysterious 3-letter formula was undoubtedly protective. It was carved over thresholds and homes, guarded the openings of vessels, and marked the beginnings and ends of amuletic inscriptions. A ceramic amphora fragment bears the letters across its neck, defending its contents from the destructive force of envy. A wine sieve for the rite of the Eucharist, now in a private collection in Munich, carries a votive inscription beginning and ending with this 3-letter formula, requesting divine help for Atrophimos, Eutychios, and their children. The formula's magical function is especially evident from its prominent place at the top of this papyrus amulet, containing a binding spell requesting protection of a household from the evil eye in the name of Christ. Following this incipit of Christian symbols on the textile comes a double name. First, the name Serapion can be read. This name, derived from the Ptolemaic god Serapis, survives in the Christian period primarily in connection with the cult of a martyr by this name. Next, the more complete of the 2 inscriptions gives the name Theon, before a terminal tau rho. This name is probably a variant of the name Theon, very common in Byzantine Egypt. Thus, the inscriptions on this textile pair a Christian magical formula with the name Sarapion Theon. The inclusion of names on textiles would have conveyed social status and perhaps served the practical function of marking donations to religious institutions. It is possible that the Sarapion donated this textile to a church, though its heavy loop pile would make it ill-suited to life as an altar cloth. The only secure example of a votive textile inscribed with names is the fine red and purple fragment from Oxyrhynchus that cites the expenses of a man, his wife, and children. A gift of textiles bearing donors' names is also recorded in a saint's life by John of Ephesus. I provide the reference here. Sarapion's textile, though, while possibly a votive gift, above all was designed to convey blessing and protection to this particular named individual. The profusion of propitious textual signs that form the remainder of the textile's decoration makes this clear. Besides geometric patterning, it is embellished by aniconic signs and letter forms, each enlivened with supplementary weft wrapping and surrounded by dots and shapes of contrasting colors. Purple crosses occupy all four corners of the textile. Two of these are shown on the left of your screens. Crosses also mark each end of the purple bands found near both ends of the textile, adding another 8 crosses to the 4 in the textile's corners. 2 blue ankhs, also known in a Christian context by the Latin term crux ansata, stand on either side of the inscription at one end. The ankh was an Egyptian hieroglyph meaning life and associated with the god of death and regeneration, Osiris. The evident thematic parallel, as well as its purely visual resemblance to the crucifix, made the ankh a significant symbol for Egyptian Christians. These woven ankhs are transformed from sleek textual signs by the application of color, outlining, and interlace, making them almost into jeweled, precious objects and hovering between linguistic and pictorial signification. More difficult to interpret is the pair of large blue alphas containing purple crosses and ankhs that bookend the inscription on the opposite end of the textile. The use of the alpha without the corresponding omega in a letter pair signifying the limitlessness of God is unusual and occurs only on a small set of related textiles that also feature ankhs and interlaced decoration, a selection of which I show you here and here. The quasi-architectural enhancements these alphas receive on other textiles has led to their being interpreted as church facades or sacred niches. These symbols, too, reside somewhere between text and image. The crosses, ankhs, and alphas are contained within ogival shapes, created by slivers of exposed warps. This subtle effect is also apparent on the dozen or so other textiles that display the architectural alpha motif, perhaps suggesting some kind of common circumstances of production. Indeed, they are all part of a small but distinct and likely interrelated group of textiles to which the Harvard piece belongs, that take woven words and textual symbols for their primary decoration. Ornamented with letter forms created in brilliant colors, several of these objects are also inscribed with personal names. I will turn to some of these now to help contextualize the Harvard textile. Robert Fauré's 1893 publication of textiles from the site of Akhmim, or ancient Panopolis, presents a textile fragment that may tentatively locate such products within Egyptian monastic communities. Plate 14 of the volume illustrates a fragment woven with a red ankh and twin green crosses. The current location of this piece is unknown to me, but its coloration was probably close to that of the ankh containing a staurogram illustrated on the same page in this volume and now in Berlin. The loop of the ankh contains several bold concentric circles, centering on an inscription of Greek letters in 4 rows. The top 2 rows form the female name Tamin, an Egyptian name meaning woman of the god Min. The green crosses make its Christian context obvious here, however. The bottom 2 rows of letters form the Greek epithet Neotera, meaning the younger. Neotera could be used, of course, differentiate between two women of the same name who had a difference in age, with one being referred to as the elder and the other as the younger. The term the younger was also frequently used to designate newcomers to monastic communities. The use of such epithets to structure relationships within monastic families is attested notably at Chanute of Atripe's White Monastery Federation, located just across the Nile from the site of Akhmim Panopolis, where this Ankh tapestry was unearthed. The map on this slide highlights the two sites, down in Upper Egypt. Was Tamin the Younger a junior monk in Chanute's women's community at Atripe? Does this group of textiles that favor logographic decoration and the addition of personal names originate in a monastic context? That can remain only speculation, and perhaps wild speculation at that. Let's consider another example. A red tapestry woven ankh has been cut from its original context and stitched onto a linen backing. Light blue fills the loop of the ankh and forms the background for a set of Greek letters. Unusually, the inscription reads from bottom to top, giving the Egyptian female name Tapalon. This name, like Tamin, belongs to the type of Egyptian female name that combines the feminine definite article ta with a divine name, in this case meaning the woman of Apollo. The incorporation of a Greek god into this traditional Egyptian naming format reflects Egypt's Hellenistic heritage. However, Tapalon and its variants are documented as names borne by Christian women. A certain Tapale is in fact recorded in the copious writings of Chanute, the famous monastic father at the White Monastery. Tapale was one of the women in charge of the monastery's weaving workshop. These women controlled the production of garments for both the men and women's communities. Tapale and Chanute had an ongoing, well-documented conflict, first over the monastic father's neglect of a special custom-made cloak she had made for him. A second conflict between Chanute and the weaver Tapale arose over his dissatisfaction with the replacement cloak she and another female elder produced for him. Chanute preferred his earlier cloak for its colors and decoration, which others had supposedly praised for their beauty. I reproduce some of his complaints on this slide. Far from the simple monastic garment we might imagine, Chanute's cloak was evidently colorful, fringed, and decorated. Abbot Besa of this same monastery later decried as vain and improper the practice the monks had of embroidering their garments, which he said they did in this monastery, quote, with a passion, end quote. David Frankfurter speculates on Besa's comment, arguing that it was unlikely for monks to be merely adding decorative pictures onto their garments. He writes, quote, "One might imagine they were adding symbols that endowed their wearer with prestige or even apotropaic power," end quote. Were these monks then adding textual signs and inscriptions like that found on the Harvard textile? In fact, we see the monks represented in the painted niches of the Red Monastery Church in Chanute's Federation, wearing cloaks with as yet undeciphered monograms of Greek letters, another example of textual decoration on textiles. The painting of Chanute here, at this time dead and a saint in his own right, shows him wearing a cloak fashioned over his chest and with identical monograms on each shoulder. I do not include these anecdotes or painted representations to suggest that the weaver Tapale was the woman mentioned on the inscribed textile ankh, or that the garments she made would have resembled any of those under discussion here, but merely to help contextualize these textiles within the time, place, and cultural setting in which they originated. To conclude, I'd like to point forward to the use of text on the other Ṭirāz fabrics in this exhibition and in the presentations to come. The emphasis on personal names and Christian amuletic inscriptions persists in the artistic products of the Christian community in Egypt after the Islamic conquest. The banded decoration and red lettering on this textile fragment from Dumbarton Oaks offers stylistic parallels to the Islamic Ṭirāz in the exhibition, and demonstrates the influence of the Ṭirāz fashion in the wider Egyptian community. Like the Ṭirāz that wish for blessings for their wearers, the woven letters on this textile spell out a plea for divine help. The Coptic language inscription, though, is explicitly Christian, reading, "Come to my aid, O Jesus Christ. I am the priest Victor, son of Meus." In keeping with pre-Islamic amuletic traditions, the full name, and in this case even parentage and occupation of the individual, are specified to ensure the request would be correctly understood. Islamic Tirāz, in contrast, leave their recipients anonymous, but supply the name of the ruling caliph, vizier, or other administrator, as well as sometimes a location and date. Our discussant, Jochen Sokoly, has argued that such Tirāz transmit a blessing by forming a material statement of the recipient's allegiance to the caliph. He suggests that the Tirāz, wrapped around the body of the deceased, may thus have helped distinguish believer from the non-believer on the Day of Judgment. These differences in Christian and Islamic inscribing practice are rooted in different approaches and attitudes to the conveyances of blessings, though both traditions attest to the suitability of textiles as vehicles for expressing personal hopes for good fortune and divine care of the soul. Thank you.
Okay, hello to everyone that I cannot see. Thanks, first of all, for all of our attendees for coming and listening, and also to Julie for the lovely introduction. And so now I'm going to head in a slightly different direction from Katie's really lovely presentation to talk about the ways and the reasons for which Tirāz changes over time. Because after the fact, we can recognize the graphic line quality and the emphasis on horizontality that marks Ṭirāz textiles in the Islamic period, but the kinds of techniques that are used are not the obvious ways of going about this effect. And so what we've noted in our exhibition planning is that there's a real communication happening between the two main artisanal traditions used to produce Ṭirāz, that is between tapestry woven Ṭirāz and embroidered Ṭirāz. And to understand both what changes in these two traditions and why actually we can boil it down and why these changes happen, we can really boil it down quite simply. It's because of zones of transition. So I mean this in two ways. The first is geographical and geopolitical, and the second is technical and fundamentally material. So unpacking what I mean by that. First, the changing geopolitical situation creates geographic zones of transition that create the circumstances under which textiles and textile makers become increasingly mobile. So we've just seen kind of the Roman pre-Christian moment. And if we look before the 6th century, there is pretty much only tapestry in the Mediterranean, particularly in Egypt. But from the 6th to 7th centuries, we go from an Egypt under Roman or Byzantine rule to one briefly under Sasanian or Persian rule. And it's in the Iranian and Central Asian worlds that embroidery is developing as a craft. So this may be the first time in which these two traditions of embroidery and tapestry come into contact with one another.
Meredyth, just to pause you really quick, your slides aren't full screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right, and so that's the first time that we think embroidery and tapestry are coming into contact with one another. So then finally, by the mid-7th century, we find Egypt and much of the Mediterranean is under Islamic rule. So within 100 years, the political landscape has changed inestimably, with Egypt at the center. And we have a new carrier of textile knowledge, Ṭirāz, which as a prerogative of rulership, like coinage or currency would be, it has a set look to it that's fairly conservative, and one that everyone wants to adapt to in order to serve this growing market, so to speak. So this might be the moment to remind everyone about the differences in tapestry and embroidery because they're kind of substantial. Tapestry creates a pattern by using densely packing the horizontal weft over the vertical warp, so that only the design is visible. In embroidery, you start with a finished textile and you apply a design using thread pulled through its surface with a needle. So in one, you're creating the design as you go, as you're weaving the textile, and one is applied after the fact. Hopefully this group knows that already. These geopolitical transitions have some very important material consequences in that materials and techniques that were once distinct, tapestry and embroidery, for example, have been merged under a single Islamic empire. And that empire needs Ṭirāz as a sort of material trappings of bureaucracy and administration. And so this creates a demand. So to recap the pre-Islamic situation, Byzantine textile production was primarily linen or wool carried out in tapestry technique, whereas Sasanian textiles, it would seem, were using cotton textiles with silk embroidery. And I have to make some presumptions about Iranian textiles under the Sasanians by using early Islamic textiles, because there's maybe one Sasanian embroidery, perhaps at the Naki Museum in Athens, but otherwise, most of our evidence comes from the early Islamic period. Also, regarding the asterisks on this slide, wool falls out of favor in the Islamic period for fine textiles, as sheep are generally considered a bit uncleanly, and so the material is as well. And so they're reserved for more humble or utilitarian uses. While silk becomes increasingly available and comes into more regular use in Egypt. But remember, there's a big transition that's just happened, and with it, new opportunities for movement and exchange. And since it's a lot easier to move people and ideas than climates and agriculture, what happens is embroidery gets introduced to Egypt. Now, we're not really sure what form that introduction took, because as you can see here, Iranian embroideries, which relied almost exclusively on chain stitch, so you can see these sort of loops happening here, making a little chain. And these early Egyptian embroideries have very little to do with one another, technically speaking. So here we've got mostly backstitch and some stem happening. And so you've got this baseline that's formed. Oftentimes they actually pull out a thread in order to form that baseline, although this one, if it's there, very hard to see. And these differences really only increase with time. As such, it seems more likely that the Egyptian textile workers were trying to copy the pared back, restrained aesthetic of early Islamic Ṭirāz rather than directly mimic Iranian embroidery. In fact, Egyptian weavers appear to be much more interested in subsuming the new Ṭirāz aesthetic into their own local pre-Islamic, pre-existing textile traditions. And here we arrive at our other zone of transition, i.e. how one goes from a ground fabric to the ornamentation of a textile. In embroidery, this is pretty straightforward. You weave a piece of fabric, and when it's done, that person or another more specialized artisan threads a needle and stitches a design. In tapestry, it's much more complicated. So what we're looking at here is a Byzantine-era example of inwoven tapestry. And this is in contrast to all-over tapestry, which is sort of our go-to idea of tapestry, like what the Goguenal factory in France will be doing eons later. And there were all-over tapestries in the Roman and Byzantine period. Typically, they were wall hangings done on a large scale, usually with a virtuosic amount of detail, actually. But what's interesting to our story is when tapestry is incorporated into a non-tapestry ground fabric. So here, as we can see in this close-up, and sorry, I privileged image rather than warp direction, we can see that the weaver has transitioned in the design from a fairly fine linen plain weave, although it's a bit warp-faced, isn't it? Or weft-faced, rather. To paring the linen warp so that its diameter is more in keeping with the diameter of the wool weft that is being added for the tapestry here, for both the tree motif and its background. Now, that's hard enough when you've got a pretty significant sized design like this, but it's even harder when you're talking about individual letters. So for a while in these first centuries, embroidery just replaces tapestry outright in official Ṭirāz. That is until we have new geopolitical disruptions. In the 10th century, this once merged zone of Islamic rule, which was unified first under the Umayyad dynasty, and then from 750 onwards under the Abbasid dynasty, it starts to fragment. And in Egypt, from the mid-10th century, the Fatimids, which are on this map, sort of this outlined in pink area, and they are contesting Abbasid rule, which is out of Baghdad. And they seem to want to distinguish themselves visually and technically. How orchestrated this was is up for debate, but tapestry undergoes a significant revival, at least eventually. So this is after the Fatimids are pretty established, and that's when we really see this resurgence of the older modes of the sort of pre-Islamic textile approach to tapestry. One of the things that happens is tapestry weavers bring back selvage to selvage tapestry weaving. So it goes from end to end, which really makes things a lot easier in terms of transitioning, because you only have the tension of the warps to deal with. You don't have to worry about adding the ground fabric on the sides. So the only weft in that area will be the tapestry weft, which makes things a good deal easier. But at the same time, it reopens the door to this characteristic quality of tapestry, which is its plasticity of design and of color play. And it still somehow maintains that Ṭirāz band aesthetic. But this really is the end of the story. Before the weavers return to these full-out bands of tapestry, they take an interesting detour. This piece here comes from an Egypt on the verge of Fatimid conquest. So it's still being produced, Ṭirāz are still being produced for the Abbasid court, whose caliphs are based in Baghdad. But here we already have a return to tapestry, one that is trying to look an awful lot like embroidery, or at least like embroidered Ṭirāz. So if you look at the overall view of it, you can see you wouldn't necessarily know whether it's embroidered or tapestry woven. And the weavers here have developed this really intricate way of maintaining tension between the plain weave, which is down here, and the tapestry weave, and it's also plain weave up here. There are a few strategies employed here, but I think the most visible in these details are the strong horizontals that have been created, and in particular, these self-bands. So it's a little easier to see on this photomicrograph of the reverse, but they've extended this thin line of red silk, which on the one hand helps carry the threads over to the next bit of lettering where they'll need it. But it also serves as a guideline for maintaining the tension and as a tempering element in the overall composition. And eventually the idea takes on a life of its own, so that the tapestry woven letters are seemingly incised into the linen ground, despite concealing, as we can see in this rather damaged fragment, the same supporting weft structures that both move the thread to the color where it is, the thread of the right color to the area where it's needed, and emphasize the inscription's horizontality. And the textural look of tapestries, as well as the idea of counted passes, and or in the case of this piece, stitches, that marks Egyptian tapestry as well as embroidery, then finds its way back to Iran on the edges of the Abbasid Empire. So here we have a piece whose double-darned technique of embroidery was picked up by the Buyids, who were a smaller dynasty in Iran that were alleged to the Abbasids in Baghdad, but had religious leanings that sometimes allied them, and increasingly so, with the Fatimids in Cairo. So they had this sort of balancing act in their textiles to play. And in the detail on the right, we can see the remains of a brown outlining thread that has largely gone away, which again emphasizes the affinity to the Egyptian tapestries. And in this unfinished and also damaged piece from Iran, we can see not only the same counted double darning stitch, and so you can see better here how metered and counted out these were and the overlap to really create this graphic quality. But also in the detail on the lower right here, we can see this self-band. So we've got two weft yarns through the same shed that somehow seems to be connecting to the Egyptian practice of drawing out a thread for starting their baseline, except for here, you can see we're looking right around here. It's not actually the baseline, but the center line of an inscription that was never completed. You can see with this hair here where it would have been completed. And we can even ask if the increasingly monumental style of calligraphy in official Abbasid Ṭirāz, even after Ṭirāz in Egypt under the Fatimids takes a different route, whether these coming out of Iraq are also not somehow responding to a tapestry-driven aesthetic. But of course, that's extreme speculation even for me. And so by way of conclusion, because I'm not actually going to go on and on about this, even though I really could, but I'm assuming no one wants to hear me talk about this for hours. I will just say that this story of cross-fertilization between tapestry and embroidery has many different branches that we might have explored here. So for example, in this stunning piece, the letters seem to float across this gauzy surface of the textile they're on. And this one is Fatimid. It names the Fatimid Caliph Al-Aziz Billah, under whom we see some really elaborate Ṭirāz. So we might very quickly want to categorize this piece with the floating style of tapestry within the broader flowering of tapestry that we see under the Fatimids. But in fact, this style has precursors from earlier, when Egyptian Ṭirāz factories were still producing for the Abbasid court in Baghdad. In fact, we have some examples, not unlike the one I showed in the very first slide, that mention the Abbasid Caliph al-Mu'tari. And although the inscription does not contain a place of production like this one, we can be almost certain that it and others like it were also made in Tanis, as this one was in the Nile Delta. Because we have references in the pre-Fatimid period by Arab geographers who talk about Tanis and mention this gauzy quality. So we can be mildly sure that they were also coming out, that these earlier examples were also coming out of the same site as the same factories would be producing for the Fatimids. But the reason why I'm highlighting it here is because we can still view within it that same intuitive progression of tapestry that was set into motion with the arrival of embroidery to the region. We are still talking about a freeing of the text from the structural constraints of tapestry, specifically in relationship to the ground fabric. And here, were the letters any more liberated, they wouldn't really even be attached anymore. In fact, in some of the lesser, more poorly preserved examples of these, they really are coming right off. But interestingly, the goal of tapestry weavers no longer seems to be imitating that embroidered Ṭirāz aesthetic. It's sort of taken on a life of its own. And that is so successful as a tapestry technique, this new style of this floating tapestry, that it actually ends up crossing back into Iran, albeit a good while later, in this all silk tapestry, which is a pretty rare example. And actually, this has been attributed to Egypt in the past for that very reason, because it is so close to this style. But the epigraphic style is much more allied with the monumental inscriptions of the Seljuks, and so we put it more in the early 12th century. And arguably, we could talk about how embroidery starts to copy tapestry even out of Iraq, eventually, this is a bit of a stretch, but by and by, embroidery starts to favor couching as a technique, which gives the impression, or gives the similar effect of the weft facing that you would have in a tapestry. And so embroidery suddenly becomes this all-over technique, really filling up so much more of the fabric than it normally would. And that's perhaps in response to tapestry, if we're looking for that connection. We can push it out. Either that, or embroidery wanted desperately to make use of the metal-wrapped threads that get used in Egyptian tapestry. But even in Egypt, they start doing this. So for more on the metal-wrapped threads, though, I will leave that to Robin, who is our next presenter. And thank you very much.
As you can tell from the preceding papers, Egyptian weavers were masters at using pattern, color, and combinations of fibers to create diverse effects. For the catalog accompanying the Social Fabrics exhibition, the textile collection of the Cleveland Museum of Art was surveyed to better understand the use of gold in Eastern Mediterranean textiles made in the centuries before and after the Arab Muslim conquest. The inclusion of gold in particular adds a striking dimension of luster and richness to these textiles. The CMA has 20 textiles with gold, dating from the 5th to the 12th century and of Egyptian or Yemeni manufacture. One of the Egyptian ones, seen in the next slide, will be featured in the Harvard exhibition. I'll come back to this textile in a minute. Because gold does not tarnish, the bright glittering nature of these woven decorative elements, some of which are 16 centuries old, is as remarkable today as it was at the time of manufacture. 7 CMA textiles with gold were made in pre-Islamic Egypt, roughly the 4th and 5th century. This small fragment in the next slide, decorated with motifs inwoven in linen and wool tapestry, is representative of the group. Here the gold is used only as a weft yarn in the tapestry section and contrasts dramatically with the dark purple wool yarns of the tapestry. The gold comprises narrow strips of gold foil wound around a fiber core called fillet. In an otherwise monochromatic design, the gold is used sparingly but to great effect, highlighting the eyes, gills, and fins of a dolphin, for example. While CMA has no examples of Ṭirāz textiles with gold thread that can be dated to the first 3 centuries of Islamic rule in Egypt, it has 11 fragments from the Fatimids' reign, which is the 11th century. As in the Byzantine example already seen, here the precious metal takes the form of gold threads constructed of thin gold fillet and again used only in tapestry pattern sections that are woven into the plain weave linen ground. Compared to its spare presence in the Byzantine dolphin, a more generous use of gold can be seen in the next example, an early 11th century textile naming the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim, who reigned from 996 to 1021. Here it's deployed in 2 ways. In the dark blue-green band seen up close in the next slide, it highlights the bird motifs. In the inscription bands, it fills the negative space around the letters. An image of the inscription taken under higher magnification better reveals the construction of the gold fillet and shows how the weaver has contrasted the surface qualities of the threads. The letters themselves are rendered in a relatively matte white linen outlined in shiny red silk, while the interstitial space is filled with lustrous gold. Other examples from the Fatimid period demonstrate that by varying the color of the core and the fillet from cooler to warmer hues, the apparent tone of the gold itself can be subtly shifted. Some Tirāz textiles from the Fatimid period merely create the appearance of gold. Many of the design elements in this textile and the next one you'll see are woven from a shiny yellow silk like that used for the filet cores. In the right lighting conditions and at a distance, the yellow silk effectively suggests the use of precious metal. In contrast to the filet technique, artisans in medieval Yemen applied gold leaf to textiles after they were woven. In this slide, the CMA collection includes these two examples of plain weave cotton Yemeni textiles from the late 10th century, which were produced using the ikat technique, where the yarn is resist dyed before weaving to produce variegated patterns in light brown, blue, and white. As seen in this slide, a very thin layer of gold leaf was adhered to the woven ikat with a gummy resinous substrate to form the Arabic inscription. The material, now reddish brown, was painted directly onto the woven textile before the leaf was applied. After the gold leaf was adhered, the script characters were outlined in black ink to further delineate them. The gold leaf is so thin it appears slightly red, owing to the hue of the resin beneath. Analysis determined the leaf was approximately 90% gold and 10% silver. Its thickness was measured at 500 to 900 nanometers. By way of a comparison, a sheet of copy paper is about 0.1 millimeters thick, or roughly 140 times that of the gold layer.
Natural dyes come from plant and animal sources and were the only source of textile colorant available until the mid-19th century. The dyes shown here, lac, indigo, weld, and madder, from the Forbes pigment collection at Harvard Art Museums, are dyes that were available in Egypt at this time. Dyes analysis is a destructive process that requires extraction from a sample, but advances in instrumentation have reduced the required amount. The image on the left is a fragment of silk embroidery from which I was able to obtain a result. The image on the right is the same sample next to a red wool fragment. The size of the red fragment increases the chance of identifying minor components as well as major ones. Natural dyes are primarily red, yellow, or blue, as well as brown. Many materials can color cloth, but a certain fastness is required to achieve status as a dye. Previous analyses have identified the dyes listed here on textiles of similar provenance. Red and yellow dyes are typically require a mordant, or typically require a prior treatment called mordanting with iron aluminum salts to attract color to the fiber. Blue is applied in a reduction vat due to the chemistry of the colorant molecule, indigo, which can be sourced from multiple plants, primarily indigo and woad. It is not yet possible to distinguish the indigo source on dyed textiles. Unlike paint, dyes cannot be mixed and require consecutive applications. The variability of these dyes means multi-step extraction is often required, as shown in the picture on the right, where a partially extracted purple fiber is red in a blue solvent. The most effective analytical technique for dye identification is liquid chromatography, which is an instrumental version of the experiment where you put a marker dot on some paper and then stick it in water and watch the colors separate. The dye extract is separated into individual component groups by the column, which would be represented by the paper, as it flows toward the detectors, and that manifests as a series of peaks called a chromatogram. The samples flow into the detectors, which measure both the color of the molecule group and their weight, which is then compared to known data from references. Purple has always been an exceptional color. Its associations with royalty come from the ancient dye Tyrian purple, which was sourced from the glands of mollusks in the genus Murex. It is the only natural purple and has a chemistry similar to that of indigo. Its exclusivity was due to the vast quantities of shellfish required to obtain the smallest amount of dye, which pushed it into disuse by the mid-7th century. A more affordable purple, such as the one seen in this cuff band, could be obtained by overdying madder, a red dye, and indigo, as seen in the extract on the earlier slide. And here we have a photomicrograph of the sample before extraction and an image of the extract. This image shows the exposed warps on the bottom edge of the textile, along with dyed and undyed tapestry woven wefts. The undyed fibers are in linen, and the dyed wool is purple. Fiber samples mounted and examined under polarized light confirmed that the undyed warps or wool, shown by the birefringence and scale pattern on the exterior of the fiber. And in this image, it is capturing the rotation of the stage under polarized light. The undyed wefts, shown on the right, are linen, which was based on the shape of the fiber shaft and the bamboo-like nodules on the fiber. Radiocarbon analysis is a destructive technique that can be used to assess the approximate age of material that was once alive. This can be useful for more precise dating of textiles than styles and techniques alone, but a more exact age is not guaranteed because environmental fluctuations in carbon-14 throughout history produce broad and narrow date ranges depending on the true sample age. Effectively, you can't tell how useful the analysis will be until you do it. It requires about 20 milligrams of textile, a volume shown in the lower image on the left, which can be prohibitive for small objects and lighter materials like silk. And these here are wool fibers from the large tapestry that Katie introduced at the beginning of the panel. Analytical costs are also a factor because samples must be sent to a specialist facility. The graphic on the right shows the environmental calibration curve from the 5th to 8th centuries in purple, the result from the sample for this textile in red, and the intersection of these two graphs in gray, which gives the approximate date range, which has a 95.4% chance probability of having been made between 435 and 608. This cuff band has purple figured animals with red tongues. Analysis of samples taken from the back of the textile show the red is madder, and the purple is also a combination of madder and indigo. And again, we have photomicrographs and the extracts. The radiocarbon analysis of this textile indicates it was made between 346 and 528 based on the environmental curve for the 4th to 7th centuries, shown in purple, and the analytical result, shown in red. The two purples are compared here along with their extracts. The textile 1924-124 has a more violet hue than the textile 2004-204. Although both were dyed with madder and indigo, the madder component varies. You can see here in the result the relative amounts of two major madder components, alizarin and purpurin, which produce slightly different shades of red. In this textile, there's more alizarin, and in this textile, there's more purpurin. Those two slightly different shades of red, in turn, result in slightly different shades of purple. And this is the large cover, again, that Katie introduced. It has colored elements in two shades of red, blue, green, and purple, as well as extensive undyed elements. Based on the analysis, the blue contains indigoids, the green is a combination of indigoids and as yet unidentified flavonoids, which are yellow molecules, possibly from weld or Persian berries. Both reds are madder, but again with slight differences in those major components, indicating possibly that two different madder sources were used to produce the slightly different tones. Interestingly, the purple does not contain any indigoids, but only madder. Madder is a polygenetic dye, meaning it can produce oranges, reds, purples, and blacks based on how it is applied with different mordants. The purple here was probably made with an iron mordant on wool rather than aluminum, which produces red. And the more purple tone here would have been a one-step process that would have eliminated the need to dye it again with indigo. Radiocarbon analysis of this textile indicates that it was made between 429 and 545. And here, because the result intersects with a relatively flat part of the environmental curve, it has a fairly equal probability of having been made at any point during this time, as opposed to the sort of different distributions you saw for the other textiles. I point this out to highlight the variability of the analysis and how you don't really know what it's going to tell you until you're told. This 12th century Ṭirāz from the Cleveland Museum of Art collection has brilliantly colored silk in red, yellow, green, blue, and black. Inscriptions on Ṭirāz often indicate the period of time in which it was made, making radiocarbon analysis less applicable. The dyes on this textile include flavonoids on the yellow, indigoids on the blue, a combination on the green, and tannins on the black, which is actually quite brown under high magnification. The red contains a combination of lac and madder. Comparative analyses of radiocarbon dating and dye identification for Egyptian burial textiles supports the arrival of lac in Egypt with the early Islamic era. The combination of two red dyes, which would also be applied consecutively, is evidence of advances in practice through demand for more luxurious goods. The colors in these shawl ends from around the 10th century include red, yellow, green, brown, and black wool. The dyes present include flavonoids and tannins on the yellow, flavonoids on the brown, flavonoids and indigoids on the green, indigoids on the blue, lac on the red, and a combination of madder, indigoids, and tannins to make black, which is sort of a very dark blue in this photomicrograph. But it's interesting because if you've ever tried the experiment with the marker and coffee filter and had a black marker separate into multiple colors, that's effectively what they were doing here to create at least an optical black. Dyes are susceptible to degradation through light exposure and moisture, and the bright colors seen in these textiles and analyzed for this exhibition were preserved by the conditions of desert tombs. Fibers are also subject to these forces, and although gold is a stable material, the organic adhesive used to apply it to the textiles may break down. Through technical study, we can learn about how dyers created nuanced color, what materials were available, what was in style, and possibly more about where or when something was made. Thank you.
First, I'd like to thank the Textile Society of America for their heroic efforts in bringing this symposium to life in a shutdown world, and also thank my colleagues for their inspiring work on this panel. In the medieval era, Egypt's fine linen textiles were coveted internationally by the well-to-do and well-connected. The textile industry generated wealth along an elaborate production chain that included producers and merchants, all overseen and taxed by government administrators. In the year 912, about the time this Ṭirāz textile was created, the richest man in Egypt was a textile merchant. Some 1,000 years later, remnants of this industry again found an international market and generated new wealth. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, innumerable medieval textiles emerged from Egypt's long-abandoned cemeteries, often through clandestine digging. As before, the enterprise required a complex interplay of producers, merchants, government officials, and consumers, but with profound differences. Fragmentary and discolored, the textiles were no longer functional fabrics, but art objects. The actions of producers and merchants had merged into the antiquities trade. The role of government officials was now primarily to protect Egypt's artistic heritage by limiting exports. Consumers were now collectors, and the terminus for the textiles became the museum collection. It is as museum objects that we will consider Ṭirāz textiles in this paper. We'll continue the symposium's overarching theme of hidden stories and human lives by looking at the individuals who helped build Ṭirāz collections for American museums. My research has focused on the 5 institutions that are lending Ṭirāz textiles to our exhibition, Social Fabrics, Inscribed Textiles from Egyptian Tombs. These are the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Cleveland Museum of Art, Dumbarton Oaks Research Library and Collection in Washington, the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and the Textile Museum in Washington. For these 5 museums, the most intense period of collecting Ṭirāz was about 1900 to 1950. by which time their combined holdings numbered more than 750 Ṭirāz. By the close of the 1930s, almost all of these objects were in private hands, if not yet in museums. As a caveat, all of my tallies are approximations, and they're probably undercounts. Museums exist because works of art outlast their makers and original users. Ṭirāz textiles prove this poignantly, bearing the marks of the bodies they enclosed. Works of art often outlive even the cultural and economic structures in which they were produced, the social fabric, if you will. Private or public collections are created out of the experiences and preoccupations of the later owners, who inevitably create new contexts and new interpretations. As wonderful as they are, Ṭirāz textiles are not the most accessible or user-friendly type of collectible. They are fragmentary, brittle, and require expert handling. Even for experts in Arabic epigraphy, the texts are often difficult to decipher. What then made these fragile and esoteric works of art of interest to American museums? We'll begin with the broad historical context in which these objects were collected, before turning to the motivations of individual collectors and how they intersected with the developing field of Islamic art history. The aerial view on the right, taken in 1904, shows the vast medieval necropolis of Cairo. The great southern cemetery from which many Ṭirāz were recovered is at the very top of this photograph, beyond the citadel. Because Egypt's climate is so dry, historic textiles survived in great numbers. In some instances, their recovery was carried out according to the scholarly standards of the day, as you see in the image from the 1930s, where an enshrouded corpse is being processed by the staff of the Museum of Arab Art, now the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo. The man in the lab coat is marking the burial shroud and outlining the area of inscription. This will be cut from the larger textile. Although we decry the practice today, it was customary to cut apart burial textiles and discard the damaged sections. The Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo has the largest single collection of Ṭirāz textiles, numbering well over 1,000. But thousands more were unearthed by members of the antiquities trade, whose primary goal was to bring vendable objects to an international market. The collectors in my study belonged to a remarkable class of philanthropists, either creators of or heirs to the titanic fortunes of America's Gilded Age. They sought to enrich their favored institutions with rare and valuable collections to advance the nation's culture and industry. Because of our time limit, I'll focus only on Americans today, but even internationally, the top Ṭirāz collectors never formed a large group. All of the collectors were deeply interested in textiles, but with the exception of George Hewitt Myers on the right, none focused exclusively on this medium. And Ṭirāz textiles formed only a small fraction of the works of art they acquired. By order of birth, our collectors are, first, Denman Waldo Ross, foundational donor to the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and to Harvard's Fogg Art Museum. Ross donated more than 10,000 works of art to the MFA, more than 6,000 of which were textiles. Of these, 55 were Ṭirāz. Next is the prolific philanthropist George Pratt of New York, whose family founded the Pratt Institute. Among his many charitable and cultural pursuits, Pratt was a trustee of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, to which he gifted more than 11,000 objects. His Ṭirāz donations represent a tiny subset of his largesse, but they stand out in a series of superb gifts made over 5 years, from 1927 to 1932, to 2 museums, the Met and Cleveland. Next, you see husband and wife Robert and Mildred Bliss seated in the gardens of Dumbarton Oaks, their estate in Washington, D.C. The 21 Ṭirāz they purchased in 1933 were ancillary to their primary focus on the arts of Byzantium. In 1936, the Blisses donated their estate, library, and art collections to Harvard University to serve as a cultural and educational institution. At far right is George Hewitt Myers. Similar to the Blisses, with whom he was well acquainted, Myers founded a private museum for his own collection, the Textile Museum, established in 1925. By 1951, his collection of inscribed textiles from Egypt was the most important in North America, numbering more than 400. Today, I'll focus on the 2 individuals in color portraits, Ross and Myers, whose involvement with Ṭirāz was more sustained than the others. Ross was the earliest, beginning in the 1890s, and Myers the latest, continuing into the 1950s. Back to back, their collecting careers span the most intense years for Ṭirāz collecting and allow us to chart their actions against the understanding of this art form. Equally important, Myers and Ross left enough of a paper trail to hint at their thoughts on these textiles. Having met the principal players, we should briefly examine the world in which they operated. The collecting of Ṭirāz rode piggyback on two larger areas of Egyptian art that were already well established. The first is ancient Egyptian art, which needs no explanation, and the second is Coptic art, what we now call Egyptian art of the Byzantine era. For brevity and convenience, I'll use the term Coptic, as did these collectors. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Coptic art had an international appeal that resonated well beyond textile fanciers, but for many it served as a gateway to Tirāz. Ross made the watercolor sketch of a Coptic tapestry on the left, just a few years before he acquired his first Ṭirāz. On the right is an illustration from a 1931 article by Myers of a magnificent Coptic tapestry that he claimed awakened his interest in Egyptian textiles. In our 5 museums, Coptic textiles were collected in much greater numbers than Ṭirāz. There was a widespread preoccupation with what we might call an evolutionary argument in the emerging field of art history. That is, how different chapters or branches of the visual arts related to one another across time and space. Ṭirāz textiles were initially valued as a continuation of, or as a foil to, the more highly prized Coptic weaving tradition. This map suggests the geopolitical situation in Northeast Africa in the first decades of the 20th century. As revealed by designations such as French Sudan, Belgian Congo, and the various British protectorates, this was the culmination of European empire building in Africa. And it was the time when Americans began acquiring significant numbers of Coptic and Ṭirāz textiles. It coincides with the period of strong British presence in Egypt. British influence diminished significantly after the signing of the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936. Most of the Ṭirāz in Western collections had left the country by the end of the 1930s when the Egyptian government tightened export permits. The most intense period of American collecting of Coptic and Ṭirāz textiles also aligns with the foundational decades of American Egyptology. In the first decades of the 20th century, the Egyptian government granted archaeological concessions to foreign cultural institutions, and departments of Egyptology were established in museums and universities across the country. Foreign domination of Egyptian art and archaeological institutions declined in the late 1930s as Egyptians exerted political and cultural independence. The coming of World War II, followed by the Egyptian government's termination of most foreign concessions, brought sharp declines in the number of Americans in Egypt and concomitantly their collecting of Ṭirāz. One reason works of art were on the move is because people were circulating more than ever. The British occupation of Egypt undoubtedly contributed to making the country accessible to Americans with little or no knowledge of Arabic. A grand tour of Egypt with a cruise on the River Nile was on the bucket list of almost anyone with sufficient means, and a number of travel companies competed for their business, such as the Anglo-American Nile Steamer and Hotel Company, which operated steamers with names such as the Puritan and the Mayflower. These trips invariably included visits to antiquities dealers who offered works ranging from the Pharaonic through Islamic eras. Among the dealers whose names appear most frequently in provenance records for Coptic and Ṭirāz textiles was the wealthy Cairene Maurice Nachman. That the world came to Cairo in the early 20th century can be confirmed by Nachman's guest book, an international who's who of archaeologists, professors, museum professionals, government officials, minor aristocrats, collectors, and fellow dealers. On this page from spring 1930, you can make out the signature of George Hewitt Myers, and on the right is a lovely Fatima Ṭirāz he purchased from Nachman on this trip. But for Ṭirāz textiles, especially those bearing legible inscriptions with historical content, the most important antiquities dealers were the multi-generational families of the Ave Mayors and the Tanos. Continuing with Myers as our example, we see an invoice from each of these firms. The more ambitious dealers operated internationally, establishing offices in Egypt, Europe, and America to extend their reach. And they pursued their clients aggressively, particularly museums. They shipped textiles to the US to be vetted by curators and private collectors, usually, but not always, on approval. Museum archival correspondence shows a great many Egyptian textile fragments circulating in the US in the 20s and 30s, and this is an area that needs much more research. With this brief background, we turn again to our two main collectors to examine their particular motives and preoccupations. Denman Ross's donations of Tirāz span the years 1896 to 1931 and represent the longest involvement with this art form among our collectors. A great deal happened in those 35 years. Ross began collecting Tirāz when the field of Islamic art was hardly in its infancy, and his involvement ended before 1934, the year Adolf Grohmann published a typological definition of Tirāz that most scholars would follow for the next 6 decades. But to consider Ross a pioneer in this specialized field would misrepresent his interests, which were encyclopedic, encompassing all manner of media and more of the globe than even he was able to cover in a lifetime of relentless travel. His collecting crossed boundaries of time, space, and medium because his primary concern lay not in the historical, cultural, or literary associations of the visual arts, but in universal principles of design. In 1899, Ross began a 25-year career teaching design at Harvard University and at the MFA. In 1907, he published A Theory of Pure Design, which encapsulated his principles and enfolded them in a moralizing philosophy. As these pages from his publication show, Ross's formalist system used lines, shapes, and a graded system of tones and color values to demonstrate the principles of design. I've outlined 2 of his diagrams that correspond to the pattern of the Coptic textile below. Ross considered textiles the supreme example of design, and he set his students to copying and analyzing them. The page on the right, which demonstrates Ross's color theories, is a student work. More research is needed, but it appears that Coptic textiles were fundamental to Ross's theories and to his teaching. Because many of Ross's gifts to the MFA and Harvard were intended for teaching, it stands to reason that his design theories informed his acquisitions. We should not be surprised then that his earliest Ṭirāz donations are notable for the Coptic style patterning that had captured his attention first. On the left is a Ṭirāz donated in 1896, and on the right, a gift of 1911. The inscriptions on these textiles are interesting, but would surely have been of little concern to Ross, whose formalist theories ignored content. As seen in these 2 Ṭirāz, donated in 1915 and 31, respectively, Ross's later gifts are of a different character. Now, decorative patterning is minimal, and the emphasis is on the text. The 1915 gift at left is one of the first purely epigraphic Ṭirāz to enter the MFA. The 20 years since Ross's first Ṭirāz donations in 1896 have been powerfully formative for the emerging field of Islamic art history, with advances in scholarship and ambitious international exhibitions. Among the most important was the monumental 1910 exhibition in Munich, Meisterwerke Mohammedanischer Kunst, and one of the Ṭirāz illustrated in the Munich exhibition catalog is strikingly similar to Ross's 1915 gift. That said, those of us who have had the good fortune to consult the scholarship of later scholars in this field, such as Louise Mackey or that of our discussant, Jochen Sokoly, we must remember that Ross was operating in a very different arena. When this Ṭirāz entered the MFA in 1915, it was cataloged as Saracenic 11th century. Appreciation and understanding of Ṭirāz textiles had again undergone a sea change by 1931, the time of the gift on the right. The advances must be credited to European scholars again, especially A.F. Kendrick of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London and Ernst Kühnel of the Kaiser Friedrich Museum in Berlin. Their illustrated catalogs from 1924 and 1927, respectively, put in place a 500-year scaffold for Ṭirāz from the Umayyad through Fatimid eras, and outlined a system of private and public workshops. Kendrick further suggested that the tapestry technique provided a continuum from the Pharaonic period forward, thus placing tapestry Ṭirāz as the final chapter of a very long-lived tradition. By the mid-1930s, the MFA's Ṭirāz collection had attained sufficient depth and quality that a catalog was planned. Published in 1938, Nancy Britton's monograph, a study of some early Islamic textiles in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, was the first of its kind from an American museum. Britton worked closely with leading scholars, especially Gaston Viette and Zaki Hassan in the Museum of Arab Art in Cairo, where she took up temporary residence. Viette and Hassan gave her a desk in the museum to carry out her work and granted her permission to publish this Fatimid ink drawing with figures wearing prominent Ṭirāz armbands. This has become the iconic contemporary representation of Ṭirāz textiles. On the right is one of 13 color lithographs that Marc Chagall created in 1948 to illustrate the Arabian Nights. Its purpose here is to show that a romantic context for Ṭirāz was developing alongside scholarly advances. As early as 1907, French curator Gaston Migeon had praised Fatimid textiles and sketched a royal context for them through historical accounts of luxurious palaces and references to the Arabian Nights. In her otherwise scholarly catalogue of 1938, Britain referenced the Arabian Nights 3 times to evoke the splendor of Muslim court life. Chagall then was up to date in adorning his king and courtiers with Ṭirāz armbands. Such romantic inclinations did not infuse the collecting of George Hewitt Myers, who seems to have been naturally inclined towards taxonomy. If Ross began acquiring Ṭirāz textiles in a period of scholarly innocence, Myers' collecting was informed by experts from the outset. For example, on his 1930 trip to Cairo, he was assisted by Percy Newberry, a British Egyptologist and collector of Islamic embroideries, and by Herbert Wenlock, then head of the Met's Egyptian expedition. Myers' involvement with Ṭirāz, which spanned a quarter century, reveals a sustained interest in the evolutionary argument. Connections and continuity intrigued him from his earliest collecting years, when, as he expressed it, quote, "The only underlying thought, if any, was to find out what went before a certain piece to make it what it was," unquote. Ṭirāz textiles, especially those with dated or datable inscriptions, fitted his preoccupation well. Early in his collecting career, he also developed an interest in technical examination when he realized that Egyptian and Peruvian tapestries shared relationships in style, technique, materials, and colors. Once again, Ṭirāz textiles meshed well with his inclinations. Among his later initiatives was a project carried out by Louisa Bellinger, who worked at both Dumbarton Oaks and the Textile Museum, to analyze embroidery and weave structures of more than 1,000 Egyptian textiles. Myers' attention to inscriptions increased consistently and dramatically. To give just 2 examples, in 1930, he purchased about 110 Egyptian textiles of the early Islamic period. Of these, about a third bear inscriptions, but only 1/10 have historical inscriptions, such as the fragment on the left. By contrast, in 1951, he acquired 59 Ṭirāz, and 90% of these carried inscriptions with historical content, such as the example on the right. Myers' trajectory reflects broader developments in the field, especially in the study of Arabic epigraphy. The year 1931 brought the first of many volumes of the Répertoire chronologique d'épigraphie arabe, supervised by Gaston Viette, then director of the Museum of Arab Art. Myers conceived a related project, which he hoped would, I quote, "be of value in clarifying the problem of dating textiles in the period of the 6th to 12th centuries AD. Our idea is that an adequate sequence of dated inscriptions from all sources can make it possible by epigraphy to assign approximate dates to undated pieces," unquote. In 1951, Myers' collection of some 400 Ṭirāz included examples from every caliphate from the mid-9th to the 13th century, lacking only 1 or 2. The most complete expression of his epigraphy project was the landmark catalog published in 1952, which presents 138 Ṭirāz textiles with historical inscriptions in chronological order. The publication illuminates Myers' tremendous collecting achievement through Kuhnel's careful translation of the inscription, coupled with Bellinger's comprehensive analysis of fibers, embroidery techniques, and weave structures. To conclude quickly, because I know I'm out of time, the collections of Ṭirāz textiles in American museums emerged from a lively interplay of professions, approaches, and motivations. Having no known personal identification with Islam or Egypt, our collectors were drawn to art as a broadening experience, and their combined efforts significantly broadened the canon for what type of art would be studied in American museums and universities. Having dedicated considerable personal wealth to Ṭirāz textiles, they entrusted their treasures to museums to be preserved but not re-entombed. They believed in art's power to uplift contemporary culture and in the value of connecting the achievements of past civilizations to what Mildred Bliss called the ever-changing present. Denman Ross hoped his collections would enable him, quote, "to speak to the people of Boston long after my death," unquote. But in fact, he and his fellow collectors accomplished something far more generous by allowing Ṭirāz textiles to address the questions and interests of every subsequent age. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you to Katie, Meredyth, and Robin as well. I know I've been working with you on this for more than 2 years now, but I still learned something. I would like to make just a few housekeeping announcements. I will be moderating the questions, so if possible, please name the speaker you want to respond in the Q&A, and I will start posting those in a moment. I would like to now introduce our discussant, Dr. Jochen Sokoly, and invite him to speak. Jochen wrote his doctoral thesis at the University of Oxford entitled Ṭirāz Textiles from Egypt, Production, Administration, and Uses of Ṭirāz Textiles from Egypt under the Umayyad, Abbasid, and Fatimid dynasties. He specializes in the arts and architecture of the Islamic world with a focus on the early caliphates, and has taught at Virginia Commonwealth University in Qatar since 2004, in addition to other research fellowships, including institutions like the Met, and curatorial consultations. Thank you, Jochen.
Thank you so much. It's very kind. I really don't want to speak too much because I think the panelists should speak. But I'm very pleased about the diversity and the approaches that have been taken by our speakers, who are all participants in the exhibition that I've also had the honor of participating in, which has kind of tried to really push the bar, in a sense, and introduce a subject that's been relatively overlooked for quite a long time, and really bring this out again into a wider discussion. And I hope, I am sure that the exhibition will definitely do that. And, you know, having been in contact with all of you, I can already see that there is a greater interest also from the conservation side, from the analysis side, an area which really hadn't really received an awful lot of attention. Also from the technology side, you know, what Meredyth was talking about is something that since Louis de Bellinger, there hadn't really been an awful lot of work on it. I mean, I've tried to work on some of these things from my limited non-textile perspective, but there needs to be more, you know, research on that front. But all of that is very encouraging. Of course, historiography and Mary's approach to look at dealers and collectors, which again, you know, it is something that has been has been done for a lot of other areas within Islamic art. We just need to look at, for example, the establishment of all the new galleries and the research that's been coming out of that. Research into the collecting of Persian art, for example. So this is a very welcome addition to this new corpus of historiography, looking at the field of collecting, and particularly with a focus on this rather overlooked corpus of objects. I have a few comments maybe on each paper that I'd like to make. I'm particularly pleased with Katie's to see, for example, that she brings out the connection between the Christian sphere and the Muslim sphere. It's, for example, the textile, the large shroud in the exhibition is something that's eluded me for a long time, and I have really understood it now. The symbolic meaning of symbols and the apotropaic symbolism of texts and symbols. Which is something that I can relate to, which I've worked on on inscriptions and how they are used in the funerary context. So I can see certain correlations there. Also, recent work by the Polish team, not that recent, it's about 20 years now, but relatively recent, who have also unearthed Ṭirāz textiles in Christian contexts. So I think that's a very welcome addition to the field. Now, looking at Meredyth, it's a very interesting theory. The interplay between tapestry and embroidery and the back and forth between spheres. I wonder if the connection with the dyes that Julie has made, particularly the red in lac, perhaps coming with embroidery to Egypt, because it's something that is very prominent. These red embroidered inscriptions, and I mean maybe that supports your theory, and there are, though, I have to say, there are some early tapestried Ṭirāz inscriptions. There is one in the Bouvier collection which seems to date from the reign of Harun al-Rashid, which is in wool, of course, but it is a proper Ṭirāz inscription following the very traditional way of Egyptian weaving. So maybe the date of introduction, maybe it is really the Abbasids that are bringing this to Egypt. And, if it is lac that is coming from the East, I mean, that could tie in very well, I think. And looking at the monumental style, it's very interesting, actually. One question that I wonder about, that I have been mulling over and over again, is whether they have used cartoons, because we do have evidence for cartoons in Coptic textiles. There are some studies that have been done on papyri, which correlate to tapestry woven designs. And I've recently found a piece that it could be a likely candidate. I wonder whether we are just missing a whole body of material there that either doesn't exist anymore or needs to be found. I remember one piece that Louise Mackey, who is also who is amongst us here tonight, and to whom I owe an awful lot of inspiration to work on this subject, showed me a textile from the Biennial Museum, in which the weaver changed track at some point. And I wonder whether that is due to the fact that, he realized it's the wrong thing what I'm doing, and it's a cartoon that they were working from, perhaps. I don't know. I mean, this is something I'm thinking about, but perhaps this, would also tie in to some of the things that you were saying, and particularly the floating style. Now, Robbins, I was particularly pleased to see the studies on gold thread. And I remember Anne Wardwell talking about gold thread back in 1993, I think, at the Cleveland Museum. So there is a very long history of the study of gold thread there. And of course, the interesting thing is that those gold threads in the Mongol realm were on a sort of, a thin skin leather substrate, probably intestine or something like that. Now, I mean, having looked at the micro photographs, that's not something I see here in this case. So there must be, so it seems like a different tradition. And it's very interesting to me. Not a lot of studies have been done on this. I think I managed to find one. I tried to look at a few with the help of Louise's microscope at the Royal Ontario Museum, but unfortunately only I managed to photograph them in black and white. And I think there's a lot there, and there needs to be more of a corpus, I think. Gold was, of course, very important. We know this from the Fatimid treasury accounts. The princesses were wearing ostentatious dresses with enormous amounts of gold, sometimes 1.5 kilos. I mean, they would be worth quite a lot of money in today's money, at any rate. Now, with the ikat, the interesting thing is when I think we looked at, when I was at Harvard, a couple of years ago, we looked at a page of the Blue Quran, and the Blue Quran seems to have the letters seem to be applied in very much similar fashion to what you found on the ikats, namely that the sort of resin substrate is painted on, and then it's gilded with gold leaf and then outlined with a thin outlining of black. And I wonder that, the whole history of the Blue Quran, of course, is a mystery, and we still don't know where it was made. But perhaps this correlation might help, perhaps, in, first of all, putting it into a certain chronological range, because we do have some dates for these ikats from inscribed ikats from Yemen, and also in a perhaps geographical range. Perhaps it's a possibility, but the theories about how to ascribe this manuscript are quite diverse, as my Islamic art colleagues will know. And with Julie's paper, it's really what struck me was the lack, and I wonder exactly if one could tie that in with Meredyth's theory. Again, I think there needs to be a far larger corpus of samples. It'd be really interesting to sample some of these silk threads, for example, in embroideries, and look at where were they embroidered, when were they made, under whose auspices, and because we have all that data, it'd be really interesting to map them somehow. I mean, that would be part of a very large project, which I would be happy to do at some point. And of course, then finally, Mary's paper, which is, I think the core of this is really the interplay between scholar collectors, dealers, museums, and scholars. So it's and the multiculturalism of this group. You have the diverse multicultural backgrounds of the dealers in Egypt, some of them Jewish, Armenian, Greek. Then the collectors in Egypt, there's Benaki, of course, who was Greek. And then, of course, the American collectors. What interests me is, why aren't the Europeans more prominent there somehow? I mean, other than Newbery, there doesn't seem to... there aren't that many big German collections, or huge British Museum has a few, but not a lot. It's really the American collections which are quite outstanding, and they really are very different in their way of collecting to what was happening in Europe at that time. The Abermeier collection, of course, in the Royal Ontario Museum is entirely due to Abermeier, the dealer, and so that kind of isn't really part of this group that you've been discussing, but of course it shows you that the sheer amount of material that these dealers had, and we still it'd be interesting to do more research into the dealers, I think, generally. And I'm sure you will. And because that really brings out the sort of multicultural and multi-national aspect of this field, which is something that, when I was working on them, it's not something that was easily accessible at the time. And I'm glad that you've been able to look through the archives much more closely. I think there'll be a lot of material. And also in Egypt, probably, I am really hopeful that one day we will find the excavation records of the Islamic Museum. I'm working on it. We will see what happens. So I'm very impressed with the whole group, and I think I should stop talking now and open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Jochen, for your kind words and your insightful commentary. I would absolutely love to join you on that project if it were to ever come to fruition. I'm going to start with the first questions that came in. This is about the provenance for the large tapestry. I was wondering if I could invite Katie to comment on that.
Sure. That tapestry comes from the collection of Hagop Kevorkian. He was an Armenian-American collector who died in the early 1960s, I believe. And we know he collected many textiles from Egypt, but we don't know the specific sites from which they were dug up, basically. So we know it comes from Egypt and the collection of Hagop Kevorkian, but we have no other contextual information for that piece. Was that the whole question?
Yeah, I think it answers directly. The other bit was, can you comment about the person in whom it was enshrouded?
So Mary discussed the practice of kind of digging up these textiles and cutting out just the bits that are interesting. So we see that these early excavations are not respectful of archaeological context at all. And we really don't know the fates of the mummies that were wrapped in these pieces. There is one mummy that's preserved in the Royal Museums in Brussels, I believe, from Antinopolis, who was excavated, I think, around 1900 by Albert Gaillet. Otherwise, we basically just have the textiles without any knowledge about the people or their specific burial context. I think a lot of the mummies that were unwrapped met fates like being ground up into fertilizer or other functional things like certain pigments were made out of these mummies. We know that. So the textile didn't protect the person from that fate, unfortunately.
Thank you, Katie. I'm going to take the next two here and just kind of roll it into one answer. The first is about using fiber optic reflectance spectroscopy, or FORS, for dyes analysis instead of chromatography. And then the next one is about variations in those minor components in matter, alizarin and purpurin, indicating a source. So FORS is an option for dyes analysis, and it's becoming a little bit more useful as it becomes more explored. Basically, what it allows you to do is take a light probe and touch it on the textile, and then the reading that it gets will allow you to sort of guess approximately what colorants might be present. It's not particularly applicable for yellows because so many of them are very similar molecules, and so many of them are the same molecule from a different source. And it's not really applicable for blues because we're only ever going to identify indigoids on anything pre-1850s. It has been started to be used for reds, but it's a little bit of a disadvantage in that you're not going to get a separation of your components, and that can be really useful. So it's a little bit like if you smelled a fragrance versus smelling all of the individual components of that fragrance. And if you smelled it as a mixture, you might only notice the most obvious tones. Whereas if you had it separated, you could see the small things that might end up just kind of becoming part of the mix. And that's where chromatography comes in as a really valuable technique, as it can separate those components. That said, the relative amounts don't necessarily tell us anything concrete about the provenance. It can be indicative. So if you see like a really high amount of alizarin versus purpurin, you can be reasonably confident it's probably Rubia tinctorum or dyer's matter. And if you see a high purpurin or mungistin and relatively low or little alizarin, then that would be more indicative of like a Rubia cordifolia or a wild matter, or possibly like a Merinda, a slightly different anthraquinone dye source. But in terms of the, it has 64% alizarin and 36% purpurin, that's not especially diagnostic. About 10 or 15 years ago, there was some research that thought maybe this could be really useful, but we've since learned that the variability in how fibers take dyes just makes that too complicated to pin down. Our next question is for Mary. Is there pressure to repatriate textiles as for other antiquities, and how in general are museums responding?
I am perhaps not the best positioned to talk particularly about Ṭirāz textiles, because it's rather ironic that although we are hosting this exhibition, the show is going to open at the Harvard Art Museums. And some people have been asking for a little more detail on the exhibition. It will open at the Harvard Art Museums in January 2022. And it will have a full catalog, and everybody on the panel is as well as Jochen, and then also Elizabeth Williams and Professor David Stern are also contributing to the catalog. I couldn't let everybody on the panel. We were only allowed to have 5 people. So just to say that the show is going to be there, but it is a lone show for us because, oddly enough, Harvard has not a single Ṭirāz textile. So I have not encountered and would not encounter any pressure to repatriate these works of art. I think what one will find is the vogue for Ṭirāz textiles really was over by about the middle of the century, and there hasn't been, as Jochen was saying, a great deal of interest in this material, and almost all of it did leave the country before the antiquities laws made the export ever so much more difficult. Did all of it leave legally? I doubt it, but it was well before the UNESCO Accords that America is trying to adhere to. So I am not aware of pressure for Ṭirāz textiles to be repatriated. I think it's also important to note that the largest collection is in the Museum of Islamic Art in Cairo. And that early period that I was talking about, I was trying to give some sense of how international Egypt was during the period of the British Protectorate. It was open to a fair amount of migration. And some of the dealers, as Jochen was saying, were not Egyptian who set up shop there. I believe Maurice Nachman may have been Syrian. I don't know where the Abba Meor family came from, but we all know Dikran Kalekian. Someone else has asked about him, and he had a shop in Cairo, and he also in New York and in Paris and in all these places. It's a very, very international group of people, and they operate really across boundaries. So I think it would be difficult to imagine a meaningful way to repatriate objects that are so decontextualized. We really have almost no information about the find spots and the conditions in which they were excavated. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Mary. Our next question is for Meredyth. Did you consider the effect of the finer scale and compactness of silk in analyzing its use for inwoven tapestry styles?
Yeah, so that's a super interesting question, because really before the Islamic conquest, there isn't silk in tapestry. I mean, there's silk around, but we're not really seeing it in tapestry. And so that first image I showed of the pre-Islamic, the Byzantine piece, where we have the pairing of the warps, the one that was turned the wrong way, the pairing of the warps so that the wool weft could go through it at an equal diameter. Well, that doesn't have to happen anymore in the Islamic period. Because silk is so fine, you can actually have silk floss. You've actually got several strands at once that are being thrown through the sheds that aren't that you no longer have to balance the weight against the linen the way you did with the wool, which was so much wider. So that makes a huge difference. In terms of actually weaving with silk, it makes things a lot more difficult because silk tangles. And so as you introduce more and more silk and are not necessarily, particularly as you're trying to mix it. So with the embroideries, you've just got a single thread that you're dealing with at a single time. But when you're weaving with tapestry and you're trying to get the ground of the background, I should say, of the tapestry portions to match the ground fabric, you're also using linen often. And that makes it really, really hard because you're dealing with something that's quite coarse and something that's quite snag prone. And so they really went to a lot of trouble to make not only the technique seem effortless and restrained and austere, but also to get that luxury silk in there.
Thank you, Meredyth. Next question, I'm going to roll two together, and these are for Robin. The first is about whether you found any metal coating on skin strips, the sort of organic metal threads in medieval Egyptian textiles. And then further to that, if you could comment a little bit on the Yemeni ikat making during this time, and the inscription on the 1950.524, which I can show if that would help.
The short answer to the first question is that no, I did not find any gilded membrane or animal substrate. But admittedly, in my survey, I was separating the gold out into the various usages, and I may have missed something there. Jochen made reference to Anne Wardwell's article, and certainly in the Central Asian silks that Cleveland featured in the When Silk Was Gold exhibition, that featured prominently in many of those textiles. And unfortunately, I can't comment on the inscription in the Yemeni textile. Mary, is that something that you can speak to?
Actually, we're not including that particular one in the show.
Right.
So I'm afraid I don't know what the Yemeni inscriptions are notoriously difficult to decipher. I think Jochen would agree with me on that. And they're very elaborated, very decorative. But I don't know that particular one. So I'm afraid not. We are including two, one from Dumbarton Oaks and the other from the Museum of Fine Arts. And Jochen has worked very hard on deciphering those inscriptions, but also Louise Mackey had done some very important work on, I think, both of those, because they do appear to have historical content, which often they seem to be blessings and good wishes.
Thank you. A question for Katie. Again, I'm going to roll just a couple together. Could you speak a little bit about the aesthetic intersection between text and image, that is the use of text as a visual device, and whether this changes after the Arab conquest? And then also if you could comment on the blue crosses on the Harvard piece being blue and not purple. I did do the analysis on that as well.
Yes. The intersection of text and image is a really large topic. And it's something that you see throughout Christian art, I would say, possibly coming out of the importance of the written word as the word of God in the gospel manuscript. So you will often see in illuminated manuscripts that the text is highly elaborated and sometimes develops into pictorial motifs in its own right. So I think that you see this interplay between visual and textual in so many different places in Christian art, both in the early period I was discussing and also later. We have several pieces in the exhibition that pair Coptic and Arabic inscriptions with pictorial images of animals and vines. And we see kind of an interplay between both the Arabic and Coptic letter forms, picking up some of the shapes and colors from those pictorial decorations that are right alongside them on those textiles. So text is always playing a very decorative role, as well as conveying certain meanings and standing as protective symbols, too, even after the Islamic conquest in Christian art. And then about the blue crosses, the textile has purple crosses in all of the four corners, and then the inscription itself is purple. And those blue motifs separate those two areas of purple on the textile. So you've got like a purple cross, then a blue ankh, purple inscription, blue ankh, and then a purple cross. So I think they've just chosen the blue to kind of offset against the purple and create this alternation of blue and purple. As to why it's blue and not, say, red or some other color, I can't say that there's any specific symbolism to the choice of blue. But what I think is really important there is the fact that they want to alternate colors to create this visual effect surrounding the inscription. I think that covers it. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Katie. A quick question for Robin. Are all of the metal threads that you've encountered in this on these textiles wrapped around a core fillet, or are they lamella?
Well, Julie and I tried to look at some of these, I think, and we had a very hard time deciphering both the cores and what the core fiber was, because we did, it's my recollection, Julie, that we looked at some, on a couple of them, we looked at this. And it was, you know, we have a lot of degradation going on, and it was very, very difficult to figure out exactly what the core was and whether or not there were cores all the time.
It can be pretty complicated, and to be fair, this is my first experience working with gold materials and textiles. But as you can, if you recall from some of the images that Robin showed, just that it can be quite hard in terms of a physical three-dimensional structure to tell what's happening and to actually even look at it without possibly affecting it further. Next question, just really quickly, Mary, if you could.
Unfortunately, I have to close out the session in 1 minute.
Okay.
It was a great session, and you should all know that through the Crowd Compass app, you can contact speakers and ask your questions and continue the discussion that we're pretty much finished. I'm sorry about that.
Please do follow up, and thank you for attending.
It was a fantastic session. Thank you.